Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hub Cures. This is a series of speakers that we're having every Tuesday to introduce, both research as well as entrepreneurial activities, as well as manufacturing activities, all how Massachusetts is addressing the pandemic. And, I think we've been getting a lot of great interest in these series. We've had, close to 600 people attending, and we get new people every week. So thank you for joining. Before I jump in and get our speakers onto the stage, I wanted to briefly talk about the MALSI Plus 2020 event on August 20th. This Hub Cure series is tied to the MALSI event. So if you, the ones who've been to MALSI before, this is our 13th year running it. It's our first year running it virtually. Last year, we had it at the Cambridge Marriott in June. This year, we were ready to have it at the Cambridge Marriott on June 25th. And then, of course, the pandemic changed all that. But the goal of MALSI is really to bring together all that translational research that's happening in our academic institutions in Massachusetts, together with entrepreneurs, investors, company scouts, all the people who are looking for research that's going to help them, bring this research to market. And so what we do here at Mass Tech Transfer Center is create those collisions between those academic inventors / entrepreneurs and the commercial marketplace. And so MALSI is organized to make those collisions happen. It's not a typical event where it's all, talking heads on a panel and things like that. It's meant to create collaboration. And so, we partner with Curious Reactor, who is curating these one-on-one, collaborations ahead of the meeting when you register. We are making, and this Remo platform has, as you will see, tables where you can network. We have multiple floors. We're going to have poster pitches. So these are translational projects coming out of universities and medical centers. You, the audience, will be able to vote on the posters, and we're going to give cash prizes to the winning posters. And so it's going to be a very interactive event. We're cutting it down from a full day to less than half a day because of the online format. We're sending you an Uber Eats a lunch coupon, so you don't even have to run out for lunch. It'll get delivered to you. And we've also lowered the paywall considerably. So the cost of joining MALSI is $0 for entrepreneurs, students, postdocs, and it's very nominal for others. Literally, $50 with a $20 coupon. So really encourage you to go register. We have registrations coming in, and we expect we get about 500 people when we do it in person. We're targeting 1,000 people virtually because it's now a global event. And Priya just posted a link to registration in MALSI. Please go ahead and register. I would also mention that we are sponsored by many great organizations, as you've seen, and most recently we have 2 new sponsors, JP Morgan and SV, a venture fund out of South Korea that has established itself in Cambridge and is looking for investments in life sciences and medtech. So with that, I'll ask Priya to bring up John Collins, and we'll get going with the event. There we go. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for being here for our Hub Cures series number 5. So, we've had many speakers before us talking about different aspects of how Massachusetts is addressing the pandemic. Today, we're going to talk specifically about this government funding program that has been ramped up very quickly in order to address an important component of the pandemic, which is testing. And John, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the background of how this program got started, how CIMIT got involved, and how UMass Medical got involved.
Sure. Well, just by way of kind of general background for those that don't know, CIMIT is a consortium-based organization. We've been around for about 20 years. And our focus on life has been to be a virtual center to really stimulate collaboration between inventors, clinicians, technologists, entrepreneurs from different organizations, bring them together, provide funding from a wide variety of sources, the NIH, the DoD, et cetera. I think the most unique thing about CIMIT is providing active facilitation. Because we have found that frankly, for those groups that are interested in commercialization that with an academic background, they really don't understand the nuances of actually getting something into market, and they make unforced errors. When they make those unforced errors, even the most promising ideas can be significantly delayed, if not killed. So it's within that context that one of the there's a program that the NIBIB started about 13 years ago. Called POCTERN. So they set up a number of centers to look at point-of-care technology research network. And they sent out bids for different organizations to propose topics. In the second round, so about 8 years ago, CIMIT had applied to create a center that was focusing on point-of-care technologies that would disrupt primary care. And when we did that, there were a number of other centers that were involved as well. But it became very clear that the way CIMIT was running this center was very different from the others because we had a lot of the infrastructure that was already in place. We had infrastructure to look at how you manage proposals, how you form collaborations, and most importantly, how you support collaborations without necessarily putting a lot of human bodies behind that. And we also had the human bodies to be able to help as well. So when that was a 5-year program, at the end of that 5-year program, there was a new call for proposals for centers. And CIMIT was asked to become a coordinating center as opposed to a center itself. And 4 other centers were named. So one is M2D2 out at UMass Lowell. They call themselves CAPCAT. Their focus is on heart, lung, blood, and sleep disorders. And one down at Emory University. And they were actually a little bit different animal. They weren't so much clinically focused. They were focused on microelectronics and basically applying that across multiple disciplines. There's a group at Johns Hopkins that's actually been there from the beginning, focusing on sexually transmitted diseases. And another center at Northwestern who's also focusing on STIs, but primarily with a third world focus. So things were kind of moving along normal pace, and all of a sudden COVID hit. And as we were looking as a network, we said, gee, there are a number of technologies that have been developed that can be redeployed to address COVID. Some were serology based, others were virus detection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So together we basically combed the projects, and we saw about a dozen or so projects that had significant potential. Simultaneous with this, and again, for me, this is the definition of where luck is the definition where preparation meets opportunity. Mm-hmm. So simultaneous with this, actually, as the story goes, Bruce Tromberg, who heads NIBIB, happened to be pulled into a conversation with James Collins and Senator Lamar Alexander. And there was a real concern that the senator had that at the time, the level of testing in the U.S. was plateauing. I can't remember the number. It was like 100,000 tests per day, which I think everyone recognized that if we're ever going to get this country back to work, that the number of tests need to be significantly expanded. And in the conversation, it was mentioned, well, yeah, there are 12 technologies that are already sitting in this network. And somehow or other, the conversation turned around to, what we really need is a shark tank. And of course, what we're doing is nothing like a Shark Tank whatsoever. But it was a concept that really caught on, and Senator Alexander had written an op-ed piece in the New York Times. And this was, let's see, mid-March. So come around mid-April, basically there was a plus-up. Originally, they were talking about some plus-ups of the order of $10–15 million, but this plus-up turned out to be $1.5 billion with a B. I want to stress this pot of money to the NIH was for a number of things. The program that we were focusing on, which is really focusing on trying to detect the presence of a virus in asymptomatic, or in people, but particularly asymptomatic people, that's called RADx tech. And that's a $500 million component out of that $1.5 billion that we are managing. So basically, we pulled together a plan where we're using our centers as resources to be able to support applicants. And we also brought in, I can talk a little bit about some of the other resources that were brought in. But when we designed the application process, we recognized that many of the applicants wouldn't really have an idea at all about the resources that were available. So in essence, we had teams apply. There were two animals that we were looking for. Either one, you've got a new idea, or two, you've got what we call a scale up. So you could have an emergency use authorization, and you're looking for ways to significantly increase the capacity, probably more than just volume, more than just more production lines, but what can you do to the design to make it increase throughput or make it easier to manufacture or whatever else that would be. So the idea is that once these proposals come in, that what we had was a group we called our viability panel, and that viability panel had a number of really world-class experts that had a diversity of expertise, from use case to technology to industry issues to manufacturing issues, and basically looked at these proposals, determined, is there a ghost of a chance with the right resources that we could meet the goal of the program? And the goal of the program was to be able to deploy tens of millions of tests per day by the fall.
So let me just dig into the goal for a second. So, we've had so much confusion about viral load testing. There was a great piece in the New York Times this weekend where this, doctor in Germany said very early on that there was asymptomatic transmission. And even till recently, the WHO still didn't agree with that. And then we have in our own country, the president sort of saying that we don't really need to test. If we test too much, the numbers will go up. So why do we need to know the numbers? So maybe we can just sort of step back for the audience and try to explain why testing is important.
Right. So the reason that testing is important, particularly at this scale, is if you want to go to work and you want to make sure you're a manager and you want to make sure your employees stay safe, you need to understand who has the virus and who does not have the virus.
Whether they have symptoms or not.
In particular, I think the science has pretty well demonstrated at this point that asymptomatic transmission accounts for order of magnitude 40%. And again, whether or not it's truly asymptomatic or that the individuals don't feel they're symptomatic, that's splitting hairs. As far as the individual is concerned, they're asymptomatic. The same thing, how do you open up colleges? How do you open up businesses? If I'm going to go into if I'm going to feel safe going into a stadium, how do I know I can go in there without putting myself, my family at significant risk? Healthcare workers, they're in your face every single day. Why should we continue to expose those people to significant risk if we can't be able to test? But I think one of the critical things here is what this point brings up is there's no such thing in my mind anyway as a silver bullet. That these use cases that we're looking at can have very different parameters. In some cases, you can retest if there's a positive. So you can, other cases, you can't. Other cases, you're going into a stadium, having a test that's done in maybe tens of seconds is acceptable. If you've got a home test, waiting an hour isn't so bad. So our whole concept here is really understanding what the different use cases were. So as we're looking at these ideas coming in, we'd be able to understand, is it likely to make a dent in the in that capacity, with not only make a dent in it, but do it within the time frame. So one of the maybe not frustrating things, because the NIH has definitely seen, we have a lot of really good proposals come in that just were not mature enough to be able to actually be deployed in the fall. And as a result, those are basically have been watched by the NIH, and they're trying to figure out how they can support some of these exciting projects.
Interesting. And so the primary outcome of this $500 million is to bring up the testing capacity of the country for all these different use cases.
Correct.
To how many tests daily?
Tens of millions.
Tens of millions of tests daily. So which means that so if we think about some of these use cases, let's look at opening schools, since that's the closest. So I've been told I have to come in person and teach in September at Boston University. Students optionally can come in or be remote. So it's a hybrid kind of option. How often would I need to be tested in order for everyone to be safe?
That's a good question. Frankly, I don't have an answer for that. There are a number of groups that are looking at it. So again, we see kind of the joke that we've been using internally. Everyone's familiar with the line of fixing your plane while flying it.
Right.
Well, our line is we're building a plane while we're falling. Right. So we don't know what the end goal is going to be, because the decisions, we're not going to tell BU what protocols to use. Right. So, but BU, what we want to do is make available through manufacturers a number of things. We'll have an idea of what we think BU may want to have, but BU at the end of the day is going to make those decisions.
Yeah, no doubt. And what I've seen now at several colleges around the country is they're setting up their own testing labs. So, BU, UNH, Dartmouth, SMU, the ones we've talked to have, and they're basically all using QT PCR, right? As so, which is the standard of practice today. And maybe you could explain that a bit, and then maybe we can now talk about all these other new technologies that you guys are seeing proposals around.
Yeah, and I'm not going there, primarily because, again, these are proposals, so I don't want to kind of sway people to one technology or another. Plus, I don't know these technologies. I'm just a mechanical engineer, so what do I know? But seriously, there are a number of really a diversity of technologies that are coming from atypical sources that have some significant potential.
That's interesting. And tell us, when you started accepting proposals, what did that pipeline look like?
Yeah, we were basically given the go-ahead to ramp this up in early April. And we opened the spigot on April 29th. So you can imagine kind of the flurry of activities to be able to put the infrastructure in place to accept these proposals. And at the same time, we needed the infrastructure to be able to support these proposals. And I've got to say that the response on both fronts. So one call for proposals that we had were proposals, obviously, for technologies. The other call is we need experts. We need people to understand the different elements, either to do reviews, but more importantly, to be able to provide input to teams that don't necessarily have all the capabilities. So at this point, we've had about 2,500 applications started. We've had more than 530.
Hey, John, just a quick interruption. Yep. It's like we're having trouble with the webinar.
Okay.
A lot of people that are stuck on tables. So Priya is just going to restart it. So I'm not sure what that means. We may have to log back in a minute. So for everybody that's on and who can see us, we're just going to restart, and you may have to click back on the Remo link that you had. All right, we're back again. Sorry about that, John. So you were saying that you launched, got the go-ahead early April. You launched April 29th, and the floodgates opened.
The floodgates opened. As I say, it's floodgates both in terms of the accepting proposals, but then we reached out to the community, and I've got to say the response from the community was just absolutely phenomenal. We said we need help. People put their hand up and said, "This is my expertise. Let me know what I can do to help." We asked them order of magnitude. how much time they could have, and frankly, we had a lot more people sign up than we had really anticipated, which was great. So then we basically started to run these projects through our process, and the process started with having a panel of experts, multidisciplinary experts from commercial side, technical side, manufacturing side, look at the viability of each one of these proposals as they come in, and determine what the path forward was. If they saw that there was a smidgen of a chance to be able to make a dent in the testing capacity in any of those use case scenarios, it was sent into what we called a deep dive. And a deep dive basically is modeled after the CIMIT crash course. The crash course is modeled after the I-Corp program, except customized for healthcare, particularly regulatory issues, economic buyer issues, all of those things that are unique to healthcare. With the exception that rather than doing this over 12 weeks, we basically parachuted in a team of what we call the SWAT team that was typically made up of at least 3 people. So there's a team lead that we would pay for, a project facilitator that we would pay for, and an associate project facilitator. The team leads had typically 30 years of experience in the diagnostic industry, so these folks knew their stuff. The project facilitators are typically program managers, oftentimes in the diagnostic industry, 15 plus years of experience. And then the assistant project facilitators, typically bachelor or biomedical engineers with a few years of experience. And basically their job was twofold, was to first rip into this proposal, understand exactly where the technology was. In our application, we did not ask the teams to put in a very detailed plan because we knew that they didn't understand the resources that we could add to them. If at any point they saw that the technologies didn't have a chance, we stopped. If they felt that it did have a chance, then the next task was to say, all right, what can we do to de-risk this project as much as possible, accelerate it as much as possible, increase the testing capacity as much as possible. Now, you can imagine we're sitting here as CIMIT, where we're used to managing 10 per year, and all of a sudden it's $500 million in a few months. We did not have the resources for this at all. And I think anyone in academia would understand how long does it take to bring even a consultant on board. We'd be in the fall before we had anyone on board. So what we're able to do is, and I think one of the major things that was so clear that the NIH was really focused on results, that we were able to leverage some resources that the NIH had already been using in another context. One is the C3I program, which is kind of an extension of the Coulter Foundation run by Elias Caro. And they have a huge network of people that most of them were obviously from the Beckman Coulter network. So that's where most of our senior people for these team leads have come from. Many of them already had contracts with C3I. So the NIH basically bumped up the C3I contracts. Many of them didn't. And obviously many of the 500 or so folks that put their hand up had no relationship with C3I. How can we get them? And that's where another really critically important part of this whole, I believe, huge success so far is due to a company here in Massachusetts, VentureWell. They were originally brought in as a contracting vehicle because when we do a deep dive, we basically give each team $25,000 to cover their cost. And again, anyone, I don't know the specific contracting vehicle, but anyone that's used to NIH contracts, how do you say go on Thursday and actually start on Friday? And it was through this contract vehicle where they could vector the money through VentureWell. And then as we looked at it, that we also said, hey, VentureWell, as we need experts, can you be the contract vehicle to be able to bring these experts on board? But now we've got people from N different organizations working on N different projects. It's a huge matrix. How do we track all of the costs so that we've got the traceability that the NIH rightly, we need to know where each and every penny goes and be able to have it justified. So we're able to leverage their time card system. So everyone in the platform, other than the people that were in the original POCTERN centers that had their pay through the POCTERN centers, everyone else, basically they filled out these time cards that VentureWell managed, and then VentureWell sends out the monthly or biweekly time cards for payments for C3I and for CIMIT and other organizations. So it was a huge logistical nightmare to put this infrastructure in place. And without organizations like C3I that had the capacity, had the network in this space, and the capabilities that VentureWell brought, and it's since been extended, it would have worked in one way or another, but they were really critical players in making this a success. In addition,
yeah, that's amazing, and that really fits the story of Hub Cures. Massachusetts has this. Oops, we're back again. I think they're trying to get Dave McManus on with us, and we're having trouble getting him on. He's waiting at one of the tables, John.
Okay.
So I think that's what's going on here. But yeah, this is a little unfortunate. I think just for everybody's, some people understand. There he is. So.
Hi, John. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. David. I know. Sorry, this took. So first of all,
an adventure to see you. But I'm here now. Hello.
This is our fifth.
How you doing?
Can you hear me, David? It looks like he can't hear me. Can you hear you, John? Can you speak?
I can hear you, Vinny. Dave, can you hear me?
I can hear you. How about me? Yes.
I can hear you. Can you hear Vinny?
No.
I don't think you can't hear me. Oh boy. Okay.
I'll translate.
You'll translate, John. So. Anyways, I'm going to apologize. We moved to a premium version of this platform of Remo, and we never had problems before. Now we have all these problems. But just sort of coming back to continue the story. So you've had how many applications so far?
I can't remember the exact numbers. About 530 completed.
530 completed applications.
Right, and we had about 2,500 started, and about 1,500 are still active.
Still active, and how many of those 530 have sort of passed the deep dive and and are in work package 1, as you call it?
Yeah, so maybe just backing up for a second. So the concept here is they do this deep dive where they rip up or they rip into understanding exactly where this technology is, and then work hand in hand with the centers, to be the different POC centers, to figure out what resources do they need to be able to de-risk this project, accelerate it as much as possible, and increase the capacity as much as possible. You can well imagine in coming up with these plans, there are usually a small number of long poles in the tent. It could be supply chain issues. It could be technology issues. It could be user interface issues. There are any one of a number of different things that we could look at and say, these are the high risk items. So we identify those high risk items to be addressed in work package 1 with ideas. If you can't answer those questions within a month, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to meet the deadline. And again, it's not, don't take a month, but you have no more than a month to be able to do that. And then from there, the question, and typically we don't ask for a lot of detail about work package 2. We run some broad strokes about timelines to understand, is it likely if you do succeed in work package 1, will you succeed in work package 2? I don't want to get into the details of the numbers, but I can say order of magnitude, about 100 deep dives have completed. And we do have a number of work package 1s that actually are just in the process of being completed, with work package 2s being launched very soon. And that's a great actually segue, because a lot of the work at this point is from a leverage perspective is going to rely on the centers to look at the clinical studies that are required, look at the testing that's required. In addition to, we created a third core, we called it, which was an implementation core, which is reaching out to manufacturers, supply chain, to be able, information technology, the need, as you know, to build what we think any of these technologies might need. So we're building a lot of capacity that we understand may not need, but the worst thing to do is have a great test and then say, oh, where are we going to get it manufactured? We need that answer right now. If we don't know where it's going to be manufactured or how, we obviously can't start that work.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So UMass Medical is the center that's going to do, that's supporting clinical studies. Is that correct? Maybe you could, I'll let you be the moderator, John. You can bring David in.
Yeah, so Dave, I'm going to be the need. I'm going to grow a beard, so if you can just wait a little bit. So maybe Dave, you could talk a little bit about kind of the role that centers in general, but in particular, you guys are playing.
Sure. So first of all, John, thanks for both serving as a coordinating center for Procter and RADx, but also as a translator for this event. But yeah, so in essence, you know, I don't think it's necessary to go too far into the history of Procter, but we kind of came into RADx as a family, right? We came in as a number of academic institutions that had collaborated, all as kind of coming through the hub of CIMIT as our coordinating center. So we were kind of used to interacting and working together to support technologies and research around technologies to advance their commercialization and development. So our role in this family has been to identify pain points along the journey from identification of a promising technology through getting it commercialized along the timeline that RADx has. So what we've done as a group is to identify strengths across the point of care testing network. One of the centers, ACME, has taken the lead on test validation, which is one of the first steps along the journey from, okay, this looks promising in a deep dive, the steering panel reviews, NIH decides on who is awarded funding. And for most of these technologies, some initial external validation of their performance is required. So the ACME group at Emory, Georgia Tech has taken a lead role, but we're putting online some additional validation centers to support them. But in essence, that's the first step, is obtaining samples, doing external testing, and quickly getting that feedback to the teams themselves, led by project administrators and executives from CIMIT, but also the companies themselves and RADx leadership, to let them know this really looks like it's not worthy of continued investment, or this additional modifications required, or this looks great. And then the next step into work package 2, especially some broader prospective enrollment of people to perform the test in the intended use case environment. If it's a school, then actually doing a study in a population of school age people. If it's a back to work use case, to actually simulate that in a from several hundred people to give back to the FDA and other relevant regulators, as well as to RADx itself, to say this is worth scaling up and continuing to invest in. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing at UMass, and part of CapCat is supporting broadly RADx, sitting on the steering committee, helping support the work that CIMIT's doing, but also diving in with the actual project teams to help them design studies to advance their technologies and generate data needed by the FDA and other relevant stakeholders.
And doing it all.
So I hope, John.
Yeah, and I was going to say, doing it all during a pandemic in a tenth of the time that it would normally take, but no pressure.
Yeah. Other than that, it's no big deal.
That's right.
Yeah, and I might add that.
But it's been a fun journey, and the teams are fantastic. I think it's been really. This will be something we can look back on, John, I think proudly, and say there was a lot of really good work. That the teams are really pulling together some very promising technologies, and I think the process seems to be really working.
Yeah, and I'll let Vinny ask a question in a second, but I really do think, one of the things I really want to stress is every single person that I've interfaced with in this project has focused on the mission. There's not been infighting, there's not been my turf, your turf. Everyone has just said, what can I do to help? And they've rolled up their sleeves. It's really been a testament to, I think, the broad community. So yeah. Why don't we let Vinny ask a question, then I'll see if I can translate.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, this, point of care diagnostics has been this kind of holy grail for the last decade that I've been, involved in life sciences and in academic technologies. And even though sort of, good instruments and instrumentation was becoming available, there was always this resistance, from clinicians. What am I going to do with this data? How is it going to change how I treat my patient? Is a patient going to wait, a half hour in the waiting room after the test is given? Oops, we just lost Dave.
I think they're going to try to recycle them.
Oh, I see. And then maybe he can hear me.
Yeah.
So, and I'll let him come back to sort of ask him the question.
I'm back, Vineet. I got instructions to refresh my page and it worked. Now I can hear you directly.
You can hear me. Fantastic.
My job is done.
I love it. So, what I was saying is that, point of care diagnostics has sort of been the holy grail. I've seen so many, instruments. I've launched companies out of BU to try to do this. And what they ran into over and over again is clinician adoption, because clinicians will say, look, what am I going to do with this information? Am I going to make the patient wait half an hour? Am I going to change the way I treat the patient? I feel like this is sort of our Apollo 11 moment, right? Where point of care diagnostics could really change healthcare, because everything begins with diagnosis. So it's not just about COVID, it's about everything else, isn't it, David?
It is. So I'm glad I have identified the importance of clinical testing, not just from a perspective of performance of the point of care technology, but also assessing its usability and potentially implementation challenges. And I think that is something that RADx has wisely also identified, both by scaling up, the large scale implementation core is also going to be about engaging payers and stakeholders and other important elements of this, but also the clinical studies that we propose are going to generate data from both the individual who is having the test performed on them around acceptability, but also the person performing the test, and is intended to address issues such as home use, which could totally change the way COVID testing is done. Right now, typically it's by prescription. But there are pathways through the FDA to get approval for over-the-counter use of home-based diagnostics. So we really think this is an opportunity. That might take a little longer than some of the simpler use cases that we're used to, of going to a location with a prescription for a point-of-care test to be used, and the results are just given to you faster, but under the supervision of a clinician in a conventional model. But I think there is an opportunity for us to really leverage RADx and some of the really exciting technologies to push this conversation further into new areas, such as at-home use, like a pregnancy test. That's a very different model for what is right now a very controlled, largely because of access, largely controlled process. But we're really excited that the FDA, so again, John's group has been great. They've brought the FDA leadership and those at the bleeding edge of COVID diagnostic testing to us, and we meet every Wednesday, and they've got some great templates that they've generated for teams to follow for getting their point of care technologies cleared for emergency use for some of these use cases that we just talked about. So you're absolutely right that involving clinicians both in the design of the studies, in the actual usability assessments, and also finally in some of the at-home use environments, going right to the sort of the user and designing systems. For example, a smartphone might be required to enter data about yourself to comply with regulatory pieces about reporting if you have a positive result. That's something that's got to be designed if the clinician is not part of that pathway. So companies really do need to be thinking and designing, if they want to get into a home use environment, how they're going to address these challenges. So we're trying to help them with that.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. You know, I like to say that the two labor groups in the country that have been very resistant to change are educators and doctors.
Oh yeah,
and
I can admit that you're totally right. So going outside of the RADx program, for example, as part of POCTERN in general, we've been for several years, talking about this issue, which is, you could have the greatest technology in the world, but if it doesn't fit into what clinics are used to, that's often where a lot of these technologies fall down. And so one of the things that the POCTERN does is every year it does a needs assessment, and it informs the calls for applications by the voice of both users, which is to say patients and what they want and what people with particular diseases are looking for example, in diabetes, a better way of managing blood sugar. But also we're asking clinicians, would these types of technologies fit into your workflow? And I think that's an important part of what POCTERN as a whole has been doing. And it's applying that also for RADx.
Yeah, and I think to put a finer point on that is not so much looking at the technology and saying, is providing guidance to people that are developing technologies to say, if you want to be relevant, you've got to have a test with this level of specificity, this timeline, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding these different workflows, I think that's really critical. The one point I wanted to emphasize that Dave mentioned is the involvement of the FDA. I think everyone looks at the FDA as a block. They've come in and they've done everything they can to try to explain what are the issues, what do they need to see. They've been extremely helpful. And basically, as Dave's saying, providing those roadmaps rather than waiting to see what's coming in, being very proactive up front about saying, these are the things that you need to start doing so that when you do come to us, you've got your ducks in a row. So I've got to really give them a tremendous shout out here.
That's fantastic. So there are probably people listening to us who, are thinking about submitting a proposal to RADx. Given that you've already had 550 proposals submitted, are you still encouraging people to submit proposals?
We are, but the bar's higher because the fall is closer. Fall doesn't, it's believe it or not, on a hot, muggy, rainy day, the fall is still coming. So yes, we're definitely encouraging proposals, and frankly, from my perspective, the more out of the box you are, things I think the more exciting it can be. And again, what I want to stress is, if proposals are not accepted by RADx, there are some really excellent proposals that have come in that it's painful to say we can't support them. But the NIH is definitely thinking through how can they continue to support those activities.
And these are novel technologies, but that can't fit in a time frame, but could be a game changer.
Correct. And not just for this pandemic, but certainly I think everyone recognizes that this is not a one-time event anymore.
Yeah, John, you have so much experience at commercializing these kind of medical technologies. And Dave, you've got a lot of clinical experience. Can you guys both tell me what the odds are that you're going to meet these outcomes of tens of millions of tests per day by the fall? I'm
gonna cheat because I see the numbers in terms of what the projected testing capacity is. So I'm positive, but I'm cheating. Dave?
I would agree. I'm very. I wouldn't say I haven't looked at everything John has seen. I just see the technologies advancing through the pipeline on time. They're led by fantastic teams of executives that are keeping them on point. And if they continue along this pipeline, yep.
I'd like to make one point to let Dave check me on this. One of the challenges is all of these teams that we've stood up, there are probably at this point about 25 deep dive teams that have done, 3 or 4, maybe a little bit more deep dives, and then they get taken off as things go into work package 1. So we're bringing in new teams. So we've stood up 25, 30 teams that have never worked together.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
How do you get them to work together? So one of the key premise that we had in I don't say convincing the NIH that we could do this, because they'd seen what we call our GATES model work within the POCTERN network. GATES stands for Guidance and Impact Tracking System. It's a way basically of looking at the maturity of a technology and understanding exactly where a solution is in its path from understanding what the unmet need is through to becoming a standard of care through a series of milestones, which are fairly standard TRL, technology readiness level milestones, with the biggest difference is we look at 4 domains. We don't just look at the technology, we look at the market business issues, we look at the regulatory issues, and the clinical workflow to basically say, all right, you can imagine that as a 4x10 matrix. What are the minimum set of deliverables that you need to have? So that's been the language that we've used. And again, fortunately, the FDA has stepped in, and we've been able to create a separate solution type, which is specific to diagnostics, and even a subset of diagnostics going through the EAU group. I'll put Dave on the spot. So.
Yeah, well, no, John has me even as a clinician able to use this gate system. So if he can do it, these new teams, I think, have learned this language. So what you see is almost these heat maps that you get used to kind of visually representing the progress of the team. So I think part of the success of this program has been building. I actually think one of the strengths is the fact that these are experienced executives that are coming and are assigned to the technology as a shepherd. But they really own it and form relationships with the team, but yet they have a degree of separation and less bias. So they come to us kind of shepherding, speaking a common language built on this Gates platform, and you can visually check in. We check in once a week on each as a group and daily with one another, and you can see the teams progressing through. So I think, to John's earlier point, there's something about this process that I think once it's proven successful for COVID, I think should be popularized for a variety of different point of care technology applications. Because I think if we could do this for COVID, why shouldn't we be applying this to heart disease or to other areas?
And I mean, just to sort of wrap up here a bit, it's a bit like the X Prize process, right? Where you have a grand challenge and then you have multiple teams sort of going after it.
I think that the biggest difference is these are not teams independent. As Dave said, these are teams which are facilitated teams that have an understanding of what can you pull in from the rest of the network to make these teams successful, as opposed to just on their own.
Opposed to be a sort of a competitive, it's not a beauty contest or a competitive process.
Yeah.
This is everybody sort of working towards this outcome. And, and that frankly is kind of what I think is amazing about the response to the pandemic in Massachusetts and in the US. It just shows how much capacity we have in both our state and this country to address things. And despite kind of some of the fumbling, in the political leadership at the top, the scientists and researchers and manufacturers and, venture capitalists and entrepreneurs are all coming together to sort of address this. And that is exactly what we're trying to highlight here in this HubCure series leading up to MALSI. And I really want to thank you both. I would please ask you both to stick around for a little networking on tables.
Sure.
I'm sure people are going to want to talk to you, on these tables of 6, and we'll wrap up around 6:30. But thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Vinny.
Hi, Vinny.
Priya's
Thanks.
going to pull us back on.